everyone. Perfect. We've got the recording going. Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight myself. My name's Ranger Patty, but we will be joined with Ranger Yvette out at one of the more unique sites here at Everglades National Park. Both of us are here in Everglades National Park, so not too far from all of you. I can see some of you, so I'm going to go off of you all, if that's okay. Raise your hand if you've been to Everglades National Park before. Oh, wow. Okay. Awesome. Lots of hands up. Great. So that makes me very happy to see, because we are Miami and Fort Lauderdale's, even up into Palm Beach's local national park. And we have a lot of interesting stories here to tell. I'm going to jump between a couple of slides just to give us a little introduction. So bear with me as I share screen and see where, let's see. Okay, I'm down to one screen today, so I'm a little rusty. But when we talk about national park sites, they are found all over our country. So you might see some places here that look familiar. The Statue of Liberty is probably a site, of course, that you've all seen at least a picture of. If you've been lucky enough to see it in person, that's wonderful. But it is not the only place. We have Everglades, of course, in the mix of a national park unit. We have mountains, landscapes of all sorts, geologic features, and wildlife being protected in these national park site units. And when we talk about national park sites, we're talking about places protected and preserved by the National Park Service. And as we see in those 5 pictures, these units can protect many different stories. Some of those stories might center around wildlife. So you can see the bison illustrated there, representing all the animals that receive protection in these national park units. We have landscapes and vegetation, some of it endangered, some of it unique to our land, our culture. We have landscapes and human stories and history, culture, represented by the arrowhead shape of this logo, as we call it here. And this is really encapsulating our message, what we do to the public. And it's the people of this country that these places have been protected and preserved for not just this generation, but future generations to come. And it helps tell our story here, being an American. And there's so many to learn. You can go pretty much your whole life learning about these stories. And we're going to learn about one that occurs here in Everglades National Park. And when we talk about Everglades, it's a really big place. So you can see here in this square, this is where Everglades National Park is located. And it's a huge ecosystem. So much more nature-based tends to take the spotlight here. But off to the right, you'll see in this image how close we are to an enormous city. And that city's broken up into little cities. We have places like Homestead really close by, but you can be in Doral near the airport and just take a drive out west and find yourself in one of the largest national parks. And when we talk about Everglades, as I said, so many ecosystems to explore, but the place that we'll be exploring is located right over in this area. So you'd have to come down through the southern entrance. And a lot of people don't know this site is here. And it's always fun to see the surprise look on people's faces. You all will be exploring virtually the Nike missile base today. So we're not necessarily covering plants and animals, of course. We're covering a human story, one that is intertwined with our people that live here today. And it's fairly recent history. So I guess to start off our program, then I'm going to ask you all, if you're already potentially familiar with this site, what time in history are we focusing on when we talk about a Nike missile base? You can unmute and share, or you can type it if that's faster.
No. You say.
I think of World War II mainly.
Okay. So we've got World War II in the mix. It definitely is connected. We'll review why. So World War II, not exactly right. We're going a little after, if that helps you all maybe determine another answer. What happens after World War II?
The Cold War?
Yeah, the Cold War, exactly. So the Cold War, Mr. Estrada, do we have anyone in the class who agreed with that? I'm not sure if you're going to transfer answers, just checking. Okay, awesome. So yes, exactly, the Cold War. And there was a specific event that connects South Florida to all of this. So without further ado, let me get this going now here. And I apologize, I'm down to one screen, of course, which is making it a little more tedious. But when we talk about the Cold War, that's a long period of time that happened after World War II. We are specifically intertwined into this history when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. So when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's a little bit later in the Cold War. We're talking 1960s. And here in Everglades National Park, we have become part of this history because we'll talk with time, but there is a Nike missile base located here in this place that was preserved for its wilderness, for its waters, its wetlands. We have a Nike missile base. So when you're driving through Everglades National Park, you come across a place that today is this building where this arrow is pointing. This is a building where scientists work now. You've got offices there, but when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, quick construction came about here in the Everglades to build a Nike missile base, and you would have later found this radio towers, barracks for the US Army here, all happening in Everglades National Park. Now, Ranger Yvette, who will be showing us around, is not here at this building. She is where the missiles would have been stored. So a mile south of this building is where our missiles are stored. And she will be joining us from this area. There are 3 missile barns located a mile south of that building, what's now called the Daniel Beard Center. And this is where those missiles would have been stored, because you can't store them right outside in your backyard. You got to space it out a little bit, of course. And this was a place that is, once again, kind of strange for a national park. You would have been met by soldiers here, and they would have had fences, multiple fences, to prevent visitors from coming in willy-nilly. You would have had the use of deadly force being authorized in this area, but this was no secret out here in the Everglades. However, because it's no secret, of course, you need to have those protections in place. And when we think of the Cold War, we have many things escalating really quickly, particularly an arms race coming up between what was the Soviet Union, now we reference it as Russia, of course, and the United States. And all this was really, really catapulted by the ending of World War II, the use of atomic weapons. And this arms race between world powers was really picking up. So when we think of World War II and that connection, as we mentioned earlier, it would have been that arms race beginning. And we have the Soviet Union versus the United States, but now Cuba gets in the mix. And we'll highlight that a little bit more. But when we think about Cuba in that respect, think of its location, where it is, where we are, and how our locations really affect that. I'm going to go now to Ranger Yvette, who's out at the missile barn, and she's going to reflect more on the soldiers there and the history, the stories that happened in that area. So Ranger Yvette, we are ready to join you.
Well, hello and welcome to Nike Missile Base. What a wonderful travel back in time. And here we are in that very place that Ranger Patty was telling us about. Now, I want you to put your mind to those times. This wasn't just yesterday. It wasn't a time of cell phone communication. Things were a little bit arduous, to say the least, and pretty complicated. The soldiers that lived here were between the ages of 18 and maybe the oldest about 25. So they weren't very old. And if you think of yourself, you guys can probably relate at this age, perhaps very close to 18, some of you, you're not necessarily thinking about nuclear weapons. And you're not necessarily thinking about pressing a button to let nuclear weapons fly. And you're probably not thinking about getting moved to another place in the United States that may not necessarily be what you know or what you expect. But for these soldiers, that was the reality of life. That's what was going on. Overnight, all of the gentlemen that were stationed here, and at the time it was only men, actually boarded a train in Texas in October and were literally shipped out here just outside of Everglades National Park. They were stationed just outside for a few years before these beautiful facilities, both the barracks that Ranger Patty was telling you about and these facilities that we're going to explore, were built. It was a rough time. If you know South Florida in the summer, you know that it's hot and it's humid and there's mosquitoes. And if you know anything about the Everglades, there's plenty of things that are looking to bite or sting you, especially in the summer months. Well, these gentlemen were here in October and they came to South Florida, like I said, to serve in October. And although October is not necessarily the hottest time of year, it can still be pretty warm. We can still consider that summer. So they were met with these conditions. And although they served through the winter months, they continued to serve for many years after that. Communication here was pretty difficult. If you think of the times when the soldiers were serving in the early 60s, what was going on in the world were things like the Flintstones, for example. It was a time of Andy Warhol. There was radios. Maybe you've seen them on TV or in a old cartoon, but the radios were actually these entire cabinets. And telephone communication was primarily through payphones. If you wanted to send any type of communication to family and friends, you had to write or type a letter, put it in an envelope, get a stamp, and find yourself a post office. So it was a very different time from today. So these young men came here to South Florida. They were caught with the surprise of the conditions while wearing a wool uniform in South Florida with metal hats with a whole bunch of strangers, not very different from the military today. It's not like you're friends from the time that you get there and you had a brand new place. So one of the things that we like to highlight about this place is the fact that during these hard times, you know, being alone is not necessarily the best thing, right? If you think of some hard times that we've recently passed as a country, for example, the pandemic was pretty difficult where we all hunkered down. We didn't necessarily know what to expect from one day to the next. That was a difficult time for us in our current history. But for these soldiers being here by themselves, being disconnected from their families, and facing the fear of nuclear warfare, those, I think we could agree, were all hard times. I want you to think for a second, and maybe you can type in the chat or just quickly unmute yourself. I know we have a small group. Who do you turn to in hard times? Who do you turn to for support? And how do you reciprocate that?
My mother.
Your mother.
And how do you reciprocate? If you turn to them for support, how do they know that they can turn to you for support?
They trust me. It's been with them their entire life.
Well, yeah, when it comes to moms or families, it's that bond of being there for an entire life. Do any of you have pets? You can show me with a thumbs up. Yeah, some of you have pets. Do your pets kind of serve as support every once in a while? Or you snuggle up, give them a kiss, and even though they're like, leave me alone, especially if you have a cat, they still give you that love and fill your heart in a special way. Yeah, well, funny enough, these rough, tough soldiers also had animals. They were a little different, okay? The animals, this building that I'm standing in front of is actually the remnants of a dog kennel. The animals that served here on this site were actually, they had very specific dog handlers. And they weren't like these cute little dogs. They weren't even like the police dogs that you have seen in career day. These dogs were trained to rip anybody who came on here limb from limb. They were trained to kill. And they would not let go until that was achieved. That was their mission. As a matter of fact, if you think of the dogs, they had a higher ranking than their handler. That's how important they were out here. So this location actually has a fence around it, and it had a second fence that provided a corridor, if you will, that the dogs and their handlers would walk around 24/7, 365 days. Now, these dogs had to suffer the same conditions: hot, humid, rain, thunder, lightning, mosquitoes, rattlesnakes, all of that. We have records that show that we have a dog who was hit right out here with their handler, with lightning. The handler came back, had to be back on base. The dog got to stay overnight in Homestead in a vet clinic until he got better. Like, how crazy is that? But that's just how valuable those dogs were. Now, the relationship between the handlers and their dogs were incredible. They were not only very special because it was only that dog and that handler. They provided, of course, that love for those handlers. But in the barracks, we also have records of not only a dog, but a cat that live amongst the soldiers. So animals provide us tons of love, as do our families. They do that now, and they did it back then. And we have these remnants to talk about those awesome dogs. One of the dogs actually lost their canine. Now, how good would a dog that's trained to rip you limb from limb would be without their canine? So they took him to Homestead to a vet clinic who was really excited to put in a first gold tooth on a dog. Now, Ranger Gabe, if you pan over here, maybe some of our students are willing to take a look in this open field, because I've heard that the canine lost their gold tooth out there, somewhere out there, and he still remained without his canine. Well, Ranger Patty, I want to show our students a second location, some more cool history that we have out here. So I will be back with you in just a minute.
All right, thank you, Ranger Yvette. So as she moves to the next location, we'll talk a little bit more details about kind of how this all came to be, because the buildings that we are going to see today didn't happen right away, as she was mentioning. These soldiers were placed there pretty much overnight when what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis came to be. Now, when we're talking about the span of the world and the relationships during the Cold War, these were the main players right here, the Soviet Union and the United States. And when we think about weapons between these two countries, the shortest distance of anything being fired would have been over the Arctic. However, when Cuba had a very big change in government, Fidel Castro came into power, things were changing drastically in that country. The distance between now certain American cities were different, where weapons could be stored were very different. So a spy plane that had flown over Cuba had started to document weapons being placed in Cuba, which meant that many more countries, big cities, could now be at risk of what was being stored there. So we can see that map shift now towards areas that we see now. Here, being in Miami, these cities are much closer. And what popped up overnight were places where anti-aircraft missiles could be stored. So these are missiles that are intended to block anything traveling over to the United States. This front line now became really pretty much in our backyard here, or our yard in general. And as this arms race escalated, the scale of these weapons also grew with time. So there was a lot of uncertainty. The relationships between these countries was very fragile. Anything could happen. And this is what resulted these bases popping up once again overnight. The soldiers were trained in Texas, in Fort Bliss, Texas. They would have been transported down to South Florida. That base popped up right outside of the boundary of Everglades National Park. And then over time, this base was developed inside of that national park boundary. But there were others that were placed around. And today, the one that we see, one of the few that are most well preserved, not just here in South Florida, but in the entire country, is this one in Everglades National Park. There's one in California and San Francisco that's also very well preserved, of course. And as we said, this was no secret. So these soldiers, what they are doing out here is protecting this, transporting, understanding, making sure that their side of this operation is done to a T. And when we talk about the relationships of the soldiers, it's really important to reflect on that age, 18 to 25-year-olds here in the Nike missile base. So that's why we like to highlight how close you are to that age. Maybe you're already that age and you would have been the one in charge out there. We're going to tune back in to Ranger Yvette now at our next site.
I love to travel back in time that way. So thanks, Ranger Patty. That was a great overview and a great perspective that where I'm standing here right now, if I face this direction, I am literally 120 miles from Cuba, which is just a very small hop, skip, and a jump away. So Cuba was right at our heels. It was a very scary time while these soldiers worked here, very stressful time. This building that I'm actually standing in front of, before I tell you what it is, I have a question for you. I want to know who or what is Nike?
Just
I mean, the shoe brand?
Okay.
I-
Any
I
other
mean,
guesses?
Before that, guys, think what it means in Greek.
Don't give it away. It's okay. A new brand is
I'm giving them
accepted.
a really good hint. A really good hint.
Well,
I
Nike,
think,
go ahead. Go ahead.
I
Go
think
ahead.
that's pretty much everyone's first
No,
guess.
Nike, like a
Nike
shoe
for
brand.
nuclear kill.
Oh, like an
Nuclear.
acronym?
Right.
Okay.
Oh, you're thinking as an acronym. That's a very good guess, actually. I have not heard that one before. So when you think of Nike, obviously what comes to mind is the shoe brand or the sporting clothes, that brand of clothing and shoes, because it's so well known. But as your teacher was alluding to, if you think back in time or Greek mythology, Nike is the goddess of victory. And she is still very present today. If you pay attention in the Olympics, you are going to see remnants of the goddess of victory depicted throughout the things in the Olympics. For example, you see that wreath that she's holding in her hand? You're going to see that through the Olympics. There's also a very cool traditions that are done in the Olympics that include the wreath. You just have to pay attention. And now you know that connection. Because, of course, everyone in the Olympics wants to be victorious. And what a better name to name a missile base than Nike? Because what do you want to be? Victorious, right? You want to win. You don't want to be a loser. And it's really common to see Nike depicted in the hand of Zeus because they fought a war together and they promised to always have each other's back. So it's very, very common to see those two connected all of the time. So yes, Nike shoes, guess what? They want to be victorious too, right? They don't want to be failures. So what is that check mark? Is actually the wing of the goddess. So their claim is that you will be victorious if you wear their clothing or their shoe brand in whatever sport you choose to do. Here, another company that decided to also follow that same victory claim is Mercedes-Benz. So Mercedes-Benz has the 3 prongs, right, as their emblem, and that 3 prong stands for the fact that they make vehicles on land, sea, and air. But around the 3 prongs, again, you will see that same wreath. So that there's Nike, once again, they claim victory on land, sea, and air. And last but not least, every Ranger has one of these, a Rolls Royce. The Rolls Royce has the entire bodice of Nike on the hood of their car, of course, claiming victory in the world of automobiles. So very interesting use of Nike, the goddess of victory. But again, if you're going to claim a logo, what a wonderful logo that would be. Now, this building that I'm standing in front of is actually the assembly building for the Nike missiles. So Nike missiles would come. Ranger Gabe, let's turn and show the road behind us over here. Follow me this way. So the Nike missiles would arrive, they would come down this road, and they would come into this facility to get built. They would come in pieces and they would get built. Once they were built, then they would be moved to the different barns. And we can turn just a little bit. You can see the barn just above my shoulder here in the distance. We had 3 barns, and we'll explore those in just a second. So if missiles were coming in, we were building them here. If they were coming from the barns, they were being repaired. Now, one of the neatest things on this building, you probably already caught a glimpse, but is this beautiful artwork. This is original artwork. And if you know anything about Andy Warhol, this is exactly in the time of Andy Warhol, appropriate for those times, depicted in that same style. Now, what I like so much about this artwork is that these gentlemen could have drawn whatever they wanted. They had plenty of time, they had plenty of stress, and they could have drawn whatever they wanted. They chose to draw and paint a Nike missile. That to me speaks pride. That to me speaks purpose. And it also speaks unity. What a wonderful message for us to be in front of many years later. That to me is a voice from our soldiers, a way to connect to their time here. And as we move to our next location, I mentioned that these soldiers had a lot of stress, but they also had a lot of time on their hands. I want you guys to think about what you do now when you have a lot of time on your hands in comparison to what you think the soldiers may have done when they had time on their hands. Think hobbies and see what kind of hobbies you have now. And what do you think the soldiers did back then? Were they different? Were they the same? I'd love to see what you come up with.
All right, so keep that in mind. We're thinking, and Mr. Estrada, if you can share maybe some of thoughts in the classroom too, so we can get more input there, but from the group as well. What do you do to de-stress? What interests have kind of grown with time as you've grown into the person you are today? So let's kind of get some answers there, and then we'll compare it to some documentation we have from these soldiers. Okay, go. Yes.
When I'm stressed, I really like to stop for a second and just get a second perspective, because sometimes when you're stressed, that assignment or whatever you're doing might seem like it's the end of the world. But if you just take a step back, it's not that, big of a deal, and there's other ways to deal with it.
Okay, awesome. Is there anything that helps you through those downtimes? A hobby, an activity of some sort?
Listening to music helps me de-stress.
Music, awesome.
I
Okay.
like reading.
Watching sports.
Reading. What else?
Watching sports.
Watching sports, awesome. Anything from the classroom that they want to share?
The classroom we're also in the classroom, so we're the ones that's in the classroom. Yeah.
Awesome. It's hard to tell. I can't tell with the angles from the camera. I thought you were too. Okay, awesome. So we've got music, reading, sports, and a lot of that is still similar today. I always try and put myself, as you said, put yourself in a perspective to see what things are like then. Well, what happened when the Nike missile base started to become this site that people could now visit, the stories of the soldiers who worked in these sites came out. We have pictures from them. And mind you, this operation is not something to be taken lightly. These soldiers did not associate with one another on the job. What their tasks were was completely separate from a soldier and another soldier and their own tasks. That is what protected our country. That is what still protects our country today, having the pieces of our operations secret from one another. And that's something that was very obvious. One soldier over here had no idea what that soldier was capable or assigned to do. But when it's off-duty time, that's when that de-stress happens. You're not talking about work. So these are images of the soldiers out at the barracks, You can see someone at a basketball court. That basketball court is definitely not as in good condition as it is today, but these soldiers would have had a lot of those similar experiences, playing sports with one another. One story that's pretty interesting is you've got a long stretch of road here, and you've got young men being paid. What are you going to do with that money? What are you going to buy? Think of what you buy today. Maybe you buy the most recent tech, video games that come out. Maybe you are one of these soldiers that has more of an interest in cars. So this long stretch of road became a place where some of these soldiers actually would race their cars. And this was something that was a little risky in the respect that you could get in trouble. But as these sites were being protected, pieces of vehicles were being uncovered in the park. And these could potentially be some of the vehicles that were picked out of the sawgrass prairies here in the Everglades. You can even see funny pictures of a motorcycle being stored in what looks like a bathroom. So shenanigans is probably the better word, because these were things that were done on their own time. But think of that balance that needs to be met. When you have a stressful job, an assignment that needs to be done, you've got to socialize, you've got to have your support system. And those are those things that we've highlighted with the dogs, the pets, but each other. These soldiers at the end of the day depended on each other to get this job done. All right, without further ado, we will visit our last stop on the trip here. All right,
Thanks,
Ranger, Yvette, we're ready.
Yeah, I love to hear what the students were saying. It always makes my heart feel good knowing that you guys have a go-to, knowing that you have an opportunity to disconnect, to reconnect, right? That's what I like to say. You disconnect to reconnect and ground yourself, whether it's a hobby, whether it's music, whether it's taking a deep breath. All of those things are so very important. And like Ranger Patty said, we have amazing records to show us that our soldiers, yeah, they did some of those real like inner thought things, but they were also up to shenanigans. And I think that under those stressful conditions, I can probably forgive a little of those shenanigans, which makes them real humans. And that's really the most important thing, right? They're not superheroes. They're just like you and I, doing their duty for our amazing country. Now, our last stop here is actually right in front of these barns that I had talked about. These barns held our missiles. They're pretty large. We actually have 3 barns on the facility. Each one could hold up to 6 missiles. Now, when the missiles were in place, we can pan over here just a little bit. Ranger Gabe, I don't know if they can see the floor here. We'll get you, there you go. So when the missiles were out, there used to be a very large rail system that existed. All of that has gone, and this was filled in, but those missiles would be rolled out and 3 would be placed in position at a time to be prepared, as you can see in that photo. So when the soldiers were out here, whether they were in ready status, which meant that there was some threat that they needed to be prepared for missiles to be launched, or they were just practicing. They were able to move those missiles with only one person. That's how well balanced they were. And they needed to complete those tasks in a matter of seconds. So you can imagine that there was a lot of practice. Now, I do want to show you around in the barn. There might be storage stuff. I'm actually not even sure what's in there. So I'm going to invite Ranger Gabe to come with me, and you guys could take a look. We'll open up the barn for you. Surprise! Pretty awesome, right?
Ranger Yvette, just so you know, the signal
This
is a little spotty right now, but we can see it's like catching up. You're a little box for us, but we can see you still and hear you.
Okay, I'll let it catch up. Let me know when it's a little better.
It's slightly better. You can keep talking. It's the same view, so we'll just listen.
Awesome. Well, as you can see, I have this enormous missile behind me. And this is actually what Nike missiles look like. This is a replica. Although it is a replica, it is the actual missile, right? But it does not have any gunpowder in it. It is inert. A school right in Miami-Dade County called Baker Aviation actually restored this missile for us. But before we go look around in there, because I do want to show you some cool stuff, I want to talk to you about another piece of history that might hit a little closer to home. So around the same time, we had talked about the fact that this was built to defend our border from incoming missiles from Cuba. But if we go back just a few years prior to that, what caused all of that animosity was the taking over of Cuba by Castro, by Fidel Castro, the heels of Batista. And during that time, he was selected by the people of Cuba because he had promised equal money. There was not going to be a rich class or a poor class. Everyone was going to be the same. And while that sounded really great, there were many people who had gone through World War II who understood what some of that language meant and got very, very nervous. There were many people in Cuba at the time that called the United States home part of the year and would go back and forth very comfortably between the United States and Cuba. There were many prominent businesses in both the United States and Cuba. One of those was actually the Archdiocese. So the Catholic school system was very prominent in Cuba, the top-notch school system of the time. So children who were receiving education in Cuba in the entire United States was said to be receiving the best education. Well, with all of that on the forefront, Castro closed all of the schools. Well, what better way to make education equal than to go into the schools and revamp their whole education process? Today, and even back then, we understand that education equals freedom, that education equals power. And once you remove that from a country, you are stripping them of both power and freedom. And the parents understood it. The Archdiocese understood it. So as a result, they started to create secret visas. Father Monsignor Walsh actually was here in Miami, started to work with individuals in Cuba, creating secret visas for these children. He promised those parents, if you send those children to the United States, I am going to give them an education, and don't worry, you can follow history known as Operation Pedro Lights. You may have heard of them, or you may know someone in your family or friends that came as a result of those flights. That revamped the entire system in the United States for foster care for children. Over 14,000 kids came from Cuba. And while the parent children, this missile crisis halted the flights, halted the opportunity for parents to be joined with their families. And now children between the ages of 2 years old and 15 were in the United States by themselves without any family for many of them. If you talk to any of them today, which they are prominent members of our community, they would say that they agree that this was the, but Along with that sentence, they also say that they are grateful because they don't know what their lives would have been like if they would have remained in Cuba. So many of them, many years later, were reunited with their families. But before that time, these places weren't a secret. The situation that was going on, the Cold War and the crisis, was not a secret. And while parents were in Cuba, looking at perhaps missiles set up in places like Guantanamo Bay, and wondering if they had made the right decision to send their kids, their babies, to the United States for freedom. And when we had open houses in these missile bases, again, they weren't a secret. Kids would come and wonder why missiles were pointed in the potential direction of where their families were. Talk about a stressful situation. And while we have been sharing this patriotic journey of the United States and how we're proud to be in our beautiful country and what we do for each other to support, these families that we're talking about, they're perfectly innocent. They didn't sign a paper. They didn't decide to, shoot missiles across the ocean. They were regular families, just like you and I, yet faced with a really scary situation. And like I said, many were reunited with their families. But if you think of yourself at 15, which I'm pretty sure most of you have passed that, and then think of yourself 4 years later at 19, have you changed just a little bit? Probably, right? You've grown into an adult. You've become independent, especially if you had no choice. Now, many of the kids remained right here in South Florida, but many were shipped all over the United States. There are many success stories where people became professors or politicians, singers. One of the most famous singers that both him and his wife came through Operation Pedro Pan. And most recently, you could look it up, had a beautiful article with their testimony, is Willie Chirino and his wife Lily. They both came through Operation Pedro Pan. So there are many beautiful stories, but at the same time, there are many hard stories. Many students, many kids got taken advantage of. They were used in labor, or they were used in terrible situations where they were abused. So a very interesting time in our history, yet these individuals, it wasn't that long ago that we can still hear their stories. What a wonderful way to prove to your families, thank you for that sacrifice, right? I think it's pretty powerful. Now, as far as these missiles are concerned, we're going to go ahead and take a look around. Ranger Patty, how's our signal?
It was a little low. It's a little all over the place, but we got the big ideas. And then unfortunately the students got kicked out, but they could still hear with Mr. Estrada. Is that right? They can still hear us? Okay. Can they see maybe visual? Okay. All right. Awesome. So if you go up, then they will still be able to see you. So
Okay.
you can head
We'll
up there, but we're in the red with bandwidth, unfortunately.
Okay. I don't know why. We have a pretty good sky today. I'm not sure why it's so moody. But we're going to go ahead and just take our time and look around at some of the cool stuff inside of the barn. And then Ranger Patty, we'll put ourselves on mute. And maybe since you have better signal, of course, you can talk through some of the things that we're seeing.
Okay, great. So you can see that she is standing by one of the controls. So once again, the barns themselves were just for storage of the missiles. They would have been controlled by equipment like you see here in the berms right outside. So there are these kind of hill-shaped formations. That's where you would have found equipment like that. All right, let's see what else we got. And this has kind of become a museum. So a hodgepodge of things that have been preserved, found, survived, whatever has happened out there. Of course, with the elements, you can see more controls there and an image of what it would have looked like. Oh my. Vintage, retro, yes. I hope some of you recognize what that is if you're not familiar to phone.
Is that a rotary phone too? On
And
top?
look, yeah, it's got the
Wow,
spin and
that's
everything to it.
even before our time too.
And then more equipment, of course. Now this one's a little harder to see, but on the wall there's actually a paper left behind and it has an image of the Statue of Liberty on it, on that back wall. That one's a pretty unique little piece that has been left, and you can see it's off to the corner. No one can touch it there. We've got maps, of course, kind of laying the groundwork, storage compartments for pieces of the missile, because some of them may have not been put together until that they got to that assembly barn that Ranger Yvette was at. And of course, these things have fuel in them. Some of them were nuclear tipped, not all, but some would have been nuclear tipped. And we've got another view of the missile here. So just to give you kind of an idea of how fast, if you would like the length of these things was about 41 feet tall, wingspan of about 6 feet, and the fuel would have been on the bottom part of it there, but the nuclear tip indication would have been on that very tip of the missile. But all of that was solid fuel. And as we said, things escalated pretty quickly technology-wise. So these things could move really fast. They only had a range of about 75 miles though. So once again, anti-aircraft is the key here. These things would have detonated near whatever potential threat it was, not necessarily for that target point, but as close as you could get. And nuclear tipped would have meant that range would have increased when it detonated. Nothing was fired though. Important to note.
Yeah. So Ranger Patty, can you hear me in here, or am I better to outside?
The signal has caught up and we can hear you. It's a little echoey, but we can still hear you.
Well, I guess I don't want to move. It's echoey because I'm in here, have good signal, and you can hear me. Then I'm going to just go ahead and stay right here. Okay. So yeah, so just for reference, I was pointing to the area here at the front of the missile. Many times people think that this is where the explosion is going to occur, but actually the gunpowder, if you will, so it's deceiving, if you will. And so the nuclear power would have been in that section of the missile. That gas, that back section drops off just like a spaceship. So that green, what propels the missile would drop off. As that missile would be propelled up into the air, and then it would be assigned the target. The point was actually the brain. That was where the computer was. That's where the target would be assigned, and it would go towards its target before detonating just in front of that target. So we talk about these places, we talk about these times, we talk about this history, and we're able to talk about these places and times in history with these artifacts because we're in the boundaries of a national park, which is incredible. Ranger Patty had talked about the fact that there were 4 sites here in South Florida. Of the 4 sites, this is the only one that remains in this condition, that we're able to visit it and talk about these places in history. Now, there are 424 national park sites around the United States. Some of them are really beautiful, places like Everglades, of course, and Biscayne and Dry Tortugas. But then you have places like the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone and Yosemite or Zion. And you have the whole Washington Mall with about 37 different monuments that speak to our history. Then you have places like the Statue of Liberty that's iconic, that speaks to our freedom. But we have places that are a little bit more difficult, that our history is not as pretty. Places like the camps that are from World War II that show the Japanese entrapment. We have Stonewall in New York City that is an iconic, it was an iconic place for our LGBTQ community. And although it is celebrated, what happened historically wasn't that great. They stood up for their right for freedom and their right for their identity, yet they were gunned down. There was lots of massacres. There's places like Selma to Montgomery, where Martin Luther King stood up day after day, week after week for the right for women to vote, yet It is remembered with a crazy massacre of hundreds and hundreds of people. So national parks aren't all beautiful. We tell all kinds of very important stories. And the best part of my job is that I get to tell you these stories. I don't tell you what to believe. I don't tell you how to vote. I don't tell you what's right from wrong. I tell you the story. And then as you reflect and as you connect, I want you to think, especially in this place, does history repeat itself? Should it repeat itself? Can it repeat itself? And as you think about that, think about opportunities to communicate and learn and share these pieces of history with others right in our community. Because where I'm standing right now is about an hour away from your home. That's not very far. We drive farther sometimes to go to the movies or to go hang out with friends. Yet these are places that shape our history. And last but not least, before I open it up to questions, I want to bring it back to those who came as a result of Operation Pedro Pano, our immigrants, what shapes the United States, what makes us the country that we are, and what has forever been the country where people want that opportunity. Those individuals have come to the United States to create a legacy for themselves, for their family. What is your legacy going to be? What part of history are you going to fall into? As an individual, we are all very powerful to make changes on our planet, to create our own story. So I encourage you to reflect on that as we journeyed today through our Nike missile base. So Ranger Patty, I want to open it up to questions from our students, or our teacher can take some questions.
All right, so let's go ahead and take some questions if you have them.
Thank you. We do have a few students who have a few questions.
I had a question in reference to the missile. Is there some sort of maintenance that goes into it? You mentioned it was a replica. So how do you, keep it in that condition?
Yeah, so it is inert, and because it's inside of this facility, it does really well with the elements. It's not out in the rain or in the elements. It is protected in here. So we really don't have to do any maintenance at all. We don't move it. It stays exactly where you see it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So just on like a geographical note, that missile, I don't know what to call it, but the missile site is right next to the Everglades reservation.
Yeah, so the missile site is in the boundaries of Everglades National Park.
Okay.
Can you pull up a map of Everglades for them?
Yeah. And how big is it, like, in terms of acreage? So, like, what portion did the U.S. Army take over in order for the missile facility?
If I were to guess, the property where we're standing on is probably about 10 acres, would be my guess. Maybe 10, maybe maximum 20 acres at the very most. So the property actually was farmland. And when the farmers were ready to deed the property over to the National Park Service, the Department of Defense said, ooh, we want that property, and actually came in and took the property from
I already have one question.
All right, and the area I'm circling here is where that is located. So in the scope of the park, it's a very teeny little area. But as Ranger Yvette said, that central area would have been farming. So as the leases were up and farming just was finishing up there, Department of Defense came right in, and it's interesting to see the dynamic between our own Department of the Interior, Department of Defense. They had to work together and find that, like, where can we put this thing? And, even within our own country, we were having those discussions. Where should this be? Where should this go?
And is it still owned by the Department of Defense, or is it owned by the Everglades
Yeah, so
park?
it was the site was actually abandoned in 1979 by the Army, and was just, the gates were closed and they said, Everglades National Park, there you go, there's your property. And for a long time we used these really great barns for storage, because it takes time for history to become history. So it was a while before we knew exactly what transpired here. As Ranger Patty said, the information was extremely compartmentalized. So if your job was to peel potatoes, that's all you knew. If your job was to open the gates, that's all you knew. If you were a dog handler, that's all you knew. So that was on purpose, because if you were caught by an enemy, you were not able to complete that entire story for anyone.
Have you guys maintained the building, or has it changed over time? Because it doesn't look the same in the pictures as you showed us.
Yeah, so a lot of the paint has chipped off, but the roof, everything is original. Even the lights, they don't work anymore. There's no electricity out here, but it is all original. Even those boxes on that back wall over to the right, let's see if we can see those back there. That's the original power that would have been connected to that rail system that was here. So although some of the things are deteriorated, the phone is original, the paint on the doors is original. We have a first aid sign that talks about using a wooden pole if someone
Electrocuted.
so all of the things in here are original, especially on the wall. You know, the actual pieces we've brought in afterwards. The building itself is in original state.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I think you've answered pretty much the questions the students had. We've had a great time seeing a lot of this history that you have showed us today.
Awesome. And I would like to close by telling our students that the facility is open to the public. So it is today probably one of our most popular places for the public to come, but it is only open from Veterans Day in November to April 1st. So right now it is closed to the public, but you can come, from Veterans to April 1st, whether you come in the morning and visit the site with volunteers, or you join a ranger guided program at 2:30 with your families. So you're welcome to come and visit the site on your own.
Definitely. So we appreciate you doing this for us. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
It is. Yeah, it's our pleasure. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and hope to see you in the park soon.
All righty, thank you. Thank you.